When you think of a pizza restaurant featuring animatronics and arcade games, it's hard not to think of Chuck E. Cheese's, because when it comes down to it, it's basically the only one we have left. I mean, sure, Major Magic showed back up for a little bit, but that was quick. And with that being said, even Chuck E. Cheese's could go down soon too, with them filing for bankruptcy and all back in 2020. But it's still impressive to see this company still alive today. I mean, I might not be able to say that in a few years, but, you know. Anyway, besides the very possible impending doom of the company, today I'm going to celebrate everything CEC by going through its history. So without further ado, I present to you an introduction to Chuck E. Cheese's. The year was 1977, and after years of coming up with different ideas, the co-founder of Atari, Nolan Bushnell, began work on his plan to create a family restaurant with animatronics. The main game plan behind the idea was it was a restaurant that served pizza, and while the families waited for the pizza to be ready, they could play video games at the arcade, and when they did get their pizza, they could watch an animatronic show. Basically, no matter what was happening, there was some form of entertainment. The original name for the restaurant was going to be Coyote Pizza, but when the mascot costume Bushnell had ordered arrived, it was actually a rat, not a coyote. How do you screw that up? Anyway, after throwing around a few names like Rick Rat Pizza, Nolan decided to name his restaurant Chuck E. Cheese's, because in order to say Chuck E. Cheese, you have to smile. When it launched, Chuck E. Cheese's was a decent success. Bushnell quickly bought the rights to it from Atari and left Atari to continue work on his new restaurant. As mentioned previously, a huge part of what made Chuck E. Cheese's stick out from the crowd was their animatronics, even if it wasn't Bushnell's main focus. The first iteration of Chuck E. Cheese's animatronics were featured in different portraits hung along the walls of the establishment, and it featured Krusty the Cat, Jasper Jowls, Pasquale, the Warblettes, and obviously Charles himself, who at this time had a very thick New Jersey accent for whatever reason.
By now, it's probably no surprise to anybody that we got a birthday number coming up here.
Later on, a couple locations added cabaret shows for different rooms in the restaurant that would be swapped around every so often. There were a decent number of different characters that would cycle through, but the one I always see is Dolly Dimples. Anyway, after Bushnell started running Chuck E. Cheese's on his own, he tried to partner with as many people as possible to franchise more and more Chuck E. Cheese restaurants. One person who was interested in partnering with Bushnell was Robert Brock, who was a financier and hotel franchiser. Brock wanted to expand Chuck E. Cheese's big time, but was also interested in helping find a way to create bigger and better animatronics. One man working on something that could be seen as bigger and better animatronics was Aaron Fechter. Fechter worked at Creative Engineering and was a pioneer when it came to creating increasingly impressive animatronics. Brock found out about Fechter due to his animatronic creation called the Wolfpack 5, which featured multiple full-body animatronic characters. This was exactly what Brock had been looking for, and after backing out of his deal with Bushnell and partnering with Creative Engineering, Brock created his own animatronic pizza restaurant with the title Showbiz Pizza. The animatronic show at Showbiz Pizza was called the Rock-a-Fire Explosion, which was basically the Wolfpack 5 but finalized. It featured full-body animatronic characters of Fats Geronimo, Mitzi Mozzarella, Duke LaRue, Rolf de Wolf, Beach Bear, and Billy Bob. If I could say one difference between Showbiz and Chuck E. Cheese's at this time, it would have to be the focus on animatronics. But other than that, Showbiz was more or less just a carbon copy of Chuck E. Cheese's. Now that, and a breach of contract, were probably the big reasons Bushnell sued Brock. The lawsuit between Chuck E. Cheese's and Showbiz was very expensive for both sides, but ultimately went in Bushnell's favor, which, makes sense. After the lawsuit, both restaurants continued to rapidly expand, and Jesus Christ, could they have picked a worse time. The video game crash of 1983, one of the most pivotal points in video game history. A lot of people blame it on E.T. for the Atari. I personally blame it on Alf. Yeah, the video game crash hit both Chuck E. Cheese's and Showbiz hard, basically causing them to stop all expansion and rethink their life choices. This hit Chuck E. Cheese's especially hard because of just how many restaurants they had opened the previous year, which made them lose, just $15 million. Sure, showbiz was hurting, but in comparison to Chuck E. Cheese's, they were doing just fine. In 1984, Chuck E. Cheese's continued to bleed. Bushnell resigned, and they filed for bankruptcy the same year. Showbiz saw this as an opportunity to create a monopoly of sorts, and they purchased Chuck E. Cheese's in 1985, creating Showbiz Pizza Time Incorporated. After the buyout, Showbiz Pizza Time Incorporated decided to close the 100 worst performing locations, cause, good old Charles didn't file for bankruptcy for fun. During this time, Showbiz and Chuck E. Cheese restaurants remained separate, but in 1989 the decision was made to merge them. I can imagine the original idea was to merge them both into Showbiz Pizza, but when they asked Fector to hand the rights to the Rock-afire explosion over, he refused. He believed that so much more could be done with the characters, like a movie, a TV show, or something along those lines. But the folks of Showbiz Pizza Time Incorporated had no interest in paying any more royalties to Fector, so they fully rebranded to Chuck E. Cheese's. While rebranding the restaurants, they tried to reuse the animatronics from the Rock-afire explosion by retrofitting the endoskeletons with Chuck E. Cheese characters' cosmetics. Yikes. Now these animatronics always looked off to me, which makes sense knowing that they're retrofits. From a business standpoint, I get it. Reuse the animatronics that you already have so you don't have to create all new ones. But that still doesn't excuse Chuck E. Cheese for looking like a serial killer. Speaking of the retrofits, let's talk about who turned into who. Rolf turned into Charles, Fats turned into Munch, Duke turned into Pasquale, Beach Bear turned into Jasper, Mitzi turned into Helen, Choo Choo turned into Munch Jr., Looney Bird turned into Pizza Cam, and Billy Bob turned into Dust. Now when it comes to the 90s, Chuck E. Cheese's did pretty great. For a while, it seemed like their financial woes had finally disappeared. Hey, even what I would consider the most iconic design for Charles was created during this time. They also created some of my favorite animatronics around then too. To be specific, I really like these cyberamic ones. Even if Chuck himself looks like he wants to take your soul, it includes my favorite versions of Helen, Munch, and Jasper. If I were to ever get an animatronic, it would probably be this Jasper right here. He looks so good with his cheese guitar and his cartoony look. I feel like it really just represents his character well. Anyway, as stated before, the 90s was when I believe Chuck E. Cheese's was at its best. So let's talk about what exactly went wrong after that. To start it off, animatronics had kinda lost their charm to the general public. Suddenly, kids weren't so interested in watching Chuck and his friends play their show, and honestly, most people just kinda thought the animatronics were creepy. Around this time, most new locations that opened didn't get the whole band anyway, they just got the Studio C version of Chuck. So obviously, even the people that were running Chuck E. Cheese were kind of done with traditional animatronic shows. As the 2000s continued, Chuck E. Cheese's lived through moderate success, but when the 2010s hit, things really started to go downhill. In 2012, the Rockstar era began, which means this CGI version of Charles was introduced. Personally, I'm not a huge fan, but honestly, it's not that big of a deal. In 2014, Chuck E. Cheese's was bought by Apollo Global Management for $950 million. This didn't mean too much at the time, but while this was all happening, Chuck E. Cheese as a whole started gradually making less and less money each year. In 2017, it was announced that Chuck E. Cheese's would be phasing out all animatronics in the years to come, which wasn't really a surprising thing to hear, as much as it was just kinda sad. The animatronics were, and still are, set to be replaced by a dance floor, where every so often, mascot costumes of the characters will come out and dance with the kids. Now I see two flaws in this plan. Number one, I don't see a lot of kids getting super excited to dance. Honestly, I would imagine the dance floor would be barren 99% of the time. Number two, how in God's name do they plan to get mascot costumes to dance with the kids without any issues? This guy couldn't even do the Cupid shuffle without causing trauma for like 7 kids around him. How is this going to work as one of the main focuses of the restaurant? Half the point of the animatronics being used was that they don't get tired and they don't need to be professionals to do their job. This new plan falls into both of those pitfalls. That aside though, let's take a small look back at something that I kind of glossed over earlier. The Studio C show. As stated before, this is the show that most locations got after the 90s. This show started off really cool, and slowly became the bane of my existence. What do I mean by that? Well, Studio C's initial game plan was to make only one animatronic that was in a talk show setting and could be interactive. Now, I'll give them this. The original idea behind this was pretty cool. And while I still prefer the original show setup, at least it still had a neat idea behind it. But as time went on, all of the features that made Studio C an interesting idea were stripped away from it, and well, you look at the time. These days, Studio C has nothing to make it interesting or special. Either Charles is in some idle phase, or he's singing a song with the ghosts of the past, the present, and the future. Probably my biggest issue with Studio C is that it's lacking the rest of the animatronics. I understand that the Studio C bot is really impressive and cool with all these super complicated movements, but that doesn't really matter if he's never even programmed to do said impressive movements. So now we just have a single animatronic singing along with TV screens. That's dumb. But I digress. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. About halfway through 2020, Chuck E. Cheese's filed for bankruptcy. When I first heard about this, I was honestly kinda shocked. Chuck E. Cheese's was a huge part of my childhood, and honestly is still a big part of who I am today. So hearing that they could go down just because of some stupid pandemic, well, it really made me sad. While I'm sure they'll make it through this via a buyout or just recovering, I've done my fair share to help them out in their time of need. I've ordered a few pizzas, I went there like twice to play some arcade games, I bought this cup, I bought this mask, hey, I even bought this hat that does anything but fit me. Now, I'm not saying you should spend your life savings on Jasper Jowls plushies, but if this company means anything to you, I don't know, enjoy a Chuck E. Cheese pizza or something to show your support. I mean, being fair, they did out Pizza the Hut. I don't know, if Chuck E. Cheese's goes down, I feel like it'll basically be the end of the animatronic pizza restaurant era. And I just don't know if I'm ready for that yet.